I always
Yeah.
have to set it up such that I can see you, but I can't see me.
Yeah.
Because if I can see myself the entire time, I become dumb.
I do that for like client meetings and stuff. I always have my personal view, whatever. There's a study they did on that. I remember, I don't know, a couple of years ago during COVID, I feel like, where it was some like meaningful percentage of like emotional stress was decreased by not looking at yourself on camera or something. We're going to talk how to drive profits at a very high level. That's really what this is all about. So maybe really briefly, for those who don't know the both of us, we can do really quick intros. For those of you who don't know me, Mike Grinberg, I am the founder and principal consultant at Proofpoint Marketing, and I work with consulting and advisory firms on building growth systems.
Yeah. So I'm the founder and author of How to Be Second. I've been building small businesses. 0 to 10 million has been my specialty. And I've been doing that for basically my entire life. That's how I grew up, was in a family business. And now I serve at How to Be Second. And I also serve as a fractional COO to a few consulting and advisory firms, which is how Mike and I ended up in our conversation.
By the way, how great do you feel when you get to throw out, hey, I'm the author of this awesome book?
It feels pretty good. It has definitely gotten better over time because people actually know what the book is sometimes. And now that we've had enough people be like, hey, this has been really helpful for me as a person, it allows me a lot more pride in being the author of it. Right. I probably would have stopped saying it if a bunch of people would have been like, yeah, we read that book and it sucked. But none of those people have jumped out of the bushes to like tell me about it. It's mostly just good news.
Which is usually a good thing, right? Because oftentimes it's the crappy reviews that make it through, right? The average ones are like the pretty good ones don't ever make it out there. It's either like the really amazing, oh my God, this book changed my life, or this was awful, I wasted, an hour of my time. Anyway, that's not what we're here to talk. We're not here to talk about books. Profits. So, Nathan, you're an operations expert with a bunch of other experiences and whatnot as well. A growth expert with a bunch of other experiences as well. So we're going to talk about the same thing, but from slightly different points of view. And right now, kind of what I'm seeing in the market, especially with smaller firms, so say like sub 5 million, is there's kind of a common thread of feast and famine and below par or declining profits for a variety of reasons, which we may or may not want. We'll probably get into some of them as we talk. But when I look at kind of successful firms, really what they all do consistently well is consistently grow profits. Not their profit margins necessarily, because their profit margins are already healthy, but their actual dollar value profits. They consistently are growing. So they're not just growing top line and eating into their margins, they are growing top line and bottom line, right? And why is that important? Well, it's good for the owners, obviously, because most of these smaller firms are founder-led still and likely will be for the foreseeable future. It's good for employees because bigger profits usually means at least some, trickle down, if you will, of benefits and compensation and perks, etc. It's good for clients because if you are profitable, you're happier, and happier employees do better work, and it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's great if you're going to sell because people want to buy a profitable firm, not a firm that's barely breaking even. I mean, that's maybe there's some nuance there in the sense of you might want to buy a firm that's not doing so well that you see the possibility of helping it do really well, and then you can get a better deal. But in general, so framing it that way, right? But the idea of consistently driving profits really requires both solid operations and consistent strategic growth investment. Those two are oftentimes people see those as like competing interests, when in reality, they're actually very much interrelated, because I promise I'm going to stop yakking and Nathan and I are going to have a conversation. But I'm just setting this up. They're interrelated in the sense of a profitability challenge, if you will. The solution to it is usually multi-pronged, right? Yes, you can increase profits by improving utilization and improving process and improving, like, maybe just very quickly, maybe saying, hey, we're no longer going to do this. Great. But sometimes, and I would venture to say, in most of these firms, there's at least one client. Oftentimes it's the biggest client, actually, that is not profitable or not profitable enough. And the only way to really make a big dent in profitability improvement is to replace that piece of business or those pieces of business. And that requires investment and growth on the flip side. And they go together. And I think that's a good place for us to start. Nathan, if you want to add anything.
I think so. One of the things that is a community agreement at How to Be Second is that we speak from what we have done, not necessarily from what we would do. So for anyone in my community who's watching, know that I'm going to do my best to hold me to that, but I will end up in theory a little bit here. And you've said a lot of things, so let me settle on one to unpack in the short term. But something I really appreciate is this idea of replacing that first client. So let me settle into just that thing for a second. Oftentimes, when you are a small shop, you just get whatever will get you going, right? Get the business running at all. And you're not even thinking about the critical question, what are my target margins? In fact, I've asked that question to a dozen firms this year and 11 times. So one exception, the response has been, what is that? The concept of target margins when you're small is like, it's this unknown quantity. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. But effectively what you have happen is, well, I need a minimum amount to survive, your minimum viable practice, if you will, which is what David A. Fields calls it. And this makes sense. Like, okay, well, I need X amount a month to exist at all. So as long as you can get that one client to sort of hover that minimum, you sort of forget about the idea of profitability overall. Then you try to get past that and you realize very quickly, like, oh, we can't scale what we've done with the first client. Then we have to change our pricing model. And then 2 more clients later, you go, oh crap, the worst client we have is the client that we got originally. That's our best relationship, but now we would have to adjust everything about it. We'd have to double their price because we've now realized that what we did to get the minimum is unscalable. And so it's both that, like, we have to drive revenue, but we also have to start putting operations into place that can deliver on the things with consistency so that we can do that for more people and eventually know we're going to have to churn that first client. But it's not to say it didn't help you survive until you got to something operational that you could then take forward. It's just to say survival is not in and of itself scalable.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a really important thing, which is, again, a lot of these firms are founder-led, and even if they're at, say, whatever, 4 million and 25 employees or something, the founder is still there, and they've grown it from pretty much them being an independent oftentimes. And a lot of these, it's the basic, like, what got you here won't get you there, right? You posted about this. I mean, there's the book by, anyway, There's a book called We Got You Here, We Won't Get You There. I forget the guy that wrote it. He's pretty famous. Great. Anyhow, point being is it's the things from a just basic P&L management you have to change. And that's it. That target margin is really, really important because it creeps up on you if you don't actually purposefully pay attention to it. Right? And I've been there myself personally as a business in the past where you don't have it, and the next thing you know, as a solo or as maybe company of 1 to 3, you're like, wow, this is great. We're at 40% profit margin or whatnot. And the next thing you know, you're 15. You're like, what the hell just happened? Right? And it's like, I'm making as much profit now as I was a year ago, but I'm twice the size. How does this work? And I think it's a lot of people that go into this business are not business people per se, and they're not, well, some are, obviously. If you're in an accounting firm, like, you get this is usually not going to be your problem. Adventure, at least. But others, like, you're an ethnographer or you're a developer or whatever, right? And this is just not what you do. So you don't think about it that way often.
Well, I want to tackle that a little bit again from this idea of target margins. First of all, it's Marshall Goldsmith is the author of the book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, which I love. And also it hits too close to home. It's it's been a painful read for me. But one of the things that I've seen happen personally that I've consulted through, this was happening it was happening to me personally in my digital marketing agency early on. But it was also happening at this bakehouse that I worked at for about a year as a consultant. And they were effectively selling themselves out of business, which is a crazy thing to think, right? Like, they didn't understand that the totality of the cost of goods and the operational expenses exceeded the total sales value of the product. And it was it was like $4 or $5 million a year. It was large enough that those things weren't immediately apparent. And so you get this lagging situation where you're like, wait a minute, like you said, I did twice as much revenue and I lost money. What just happened? Like, how is that even possible? Something that I see happen very consistently, almost every single company that I consult with, especially in this 0 to 3 million space. This idea of target margins, I'm going to anchor to this pretty consistently, I think. When you set your target, you always have target margins. You don't realize, but you might jump into the marketplace again and get that minimum of what you can get, right? Just as survival, get your business started. Let's say you charge $50 an hour. $50 an hour is what you need to pay yourself for your hour. You might recognize you're going to lose some taxes out of that. You might have a few subscriptions to pay for, something like that. So all told, you might be getting $40 an hour. In fact, I'll say 45 for easy math. You might be getting $45 an hour and you're paying $5 an hour effectively to cover all of your operating expenses. What you have done is you have set your margins. They are 95, 5-0. 95% cost of service, 5% operational expenses, and 0% profit. You don't realize that because it feels like you're taking home $50 an hour. But then when you are faced with the idea of hiring the first person, you suddenly realize, well, I can't pay them $50 an hour. That's what I'm getting paid. But there has to be some margin for me. Oh shit, my pricing that won't work anymore. Like, you add the first person and you realize your entire pricing strategy was built on being solo, and you have to change everything in that first conversation. I've seen this happen all the way up through, and then people will make the first sort of greatest sin, and they'll be like, well, I'll just use contractors, and that's how I'll solve this, because W-2 is more expensive than. First of all, that's untrue. But second of all, it all comes down to just math, right? You can know what the math is. And a really good place to anchor is 50-30-20. This is very common in service businesses, right? A 100% markup. If you cost $50 for the service, you charge $100 for the service. But if you haven't thought about this target margins, it means you are effectively running what I see most of the time is a 95-5-0. And as soon as you go to try to outsource to scale, to even generate new revenue, you realize you have a fundamental operational miss. I don't know if that hits too close to home.
I'm sure it does for some. I know early on, I'm pretty sure I made that mistake, very, very early on years ago. So I think a couple of things that jump out at me as you talk about it, and you and I've talked about this a bunch of times now, is one, this operational mess that you just called actually contributes to, if not completely causes, the feast and famine cycle. Because when you have that oh shit moment and you go, wait a second, I don't have profits, I can't invest you literally can't. So there's the actual, I don't have the cash. But even if, let's just say you figure out how to be a little bit more profitable and you've got a little bit and you're like, okay, I'm at 5% margin, you're not very likely to go and confidently and comfortably say, well, I'm going to take this 5% and I'm going to invest it to scale. And while I also work on operational stuff, it's just not enough cushion. Really margin is cushion to a certain extent, right? If you really think about it, there's not enough cushion there for you to make that investment comfortably. So then you don't. And maybe you're full capacity now, but because you don't invest, now you have, instead of you've got 2 people you have to utilize. Or if you're larger, you've got 20 people you need to utilize. And now all of a sudden, because you're not investing in growth, your pipeline is slower than maybe it needs to be for a variety of reasons. And now you're underutilized. So now you're back to having an unprofitable business. And you go, well, crap, what do I do? And it contributes to that cycle by making this operational mistake.
I want to step one more step into that and say, yes. So if you don't have margin, you effectively don't have the cash to purchase the time. And that's important for 2 reasons. One, if you have no margins and have no cash to purchase time, it comes back to you typically as the owner. If you're actually, it doesn't matter. You could have a 30-person team. It's going to come back to you as the owner to do the thing, because you've deployed everyone within the margins you have to doing the work. So margins mean someone's time to do growth, right? Whether marketing, more phone calls, whatever. Margins mean someone's time to do revenue generation work. So if you have no margins, you have no one to do. The only person who will give free time to that is you as the owner or as the leader, whatever. The second part about that, the part that I want to really push on, is there's an emotional component to that. So we're talking about revenue generation and operational and how these 2 things tie together. And we're painting that picture. But when you have to be the person who goes, well, I have to value my time in future dollars, in hopes, and I have to invest that time right now for nothing and pray for a return on my own effort. There is, especially when you have to do that on behalf of a team, there is a bitterness that sets in, right? Because you're like, I'm $1 million business. I'm giving my time for free to pay my employees? What is, right? And that grows in there. And that starts to creep out in the cult. You can't help it. That stuff starts spilling out in ways you don't understand. So I don't want to just
Mm-hmm.
It's probably off topic, the standard, but this idea of like, hey, you need to be doing revenue generation. In order to do that, you need solid operations, part of which is setting your target margins. But then what we're really avoiding is you being shit to other human beings. Like, you don't realize that's a consequence, but it's a pretty fast consequence. So it makes you very short tempered. I know I've lived this. I've lived the lack of quality that I expected from my delivery people. And one of my business partners in my company, More Leads Online, we would have these conversations where like I would go over to his house because we lived really close to each other, and we would talk about how do we make sure that we're doing things in a quality way, basically so that I'm not upset. And and I didn't want to like jeopardize our friendship. So we're sitting there playing Super Smash Brothers and he's just beating the crap out of me because he's so much better than me. But like I'm taking an actual beating on screen while I'm talking about not giving him an actual beating, like verbally, because I'm frustrated about delivery. And so again, this it'll start popping out of you if you can't combine these two things.
Yeah, I actually don't think it's off topic at all, because the journey to growth in general, it's an emotional one. Like even if you don't have a margin problem right now, let's just, and you've figured out all the, got your target margins, etc. You're still looking to grow and maintain it. None of these firms, even the private equity backed ones that are slightly larger, you don't have unlimited budgets, right? You've got cost structures you need to maintain and all sorts of stuff. And it's daunting and emotional to figure out what to prioritize first. And there are some difficult decisions that need to be made. When you're talking profits in a service-based business, at the end of the day, it's people. That's your biggest expense. 60 to 70% of it is compensation, usually. So there's no way around that. And I think, again, my expertise, if you will, what I work with clients on is the growth side, sales, marketing, sales enablement, etc. But we have to have these conversations too. You're going to feel like crap because you have to make some hard decisions for a minute, because you have to fund this. And sometimes the only way to fund it is to potentially let people go. And there's just no, like, I've personally been, right? You don't want to do it as a founder at all. It sucks, especially if you're consider yourself at least to be a good human being. Like, you don't want to mess with people's livelihoods, etc. And it's hard. I don't think it gets any easier whether you're a firm of 5 people or a firm of 50 to 100 people, right? If you're a good human being, you're a good human being. And either way you slice it, you might have gotten used to it more by then, right? That may be the only thing, but it's still not easy. You still probably lose some sleep here and there because of it, that kind of stuff. And that's draining. It is, I think, an important thing to keep in mind as we're having this conversation, right? It's not only, this is not just numbers, you're also managing your emotions, and your emotions will affect the numbers, as you just said.
Yeah.
Inevitably. Like, you might be doing all the right stuff, but if you can't control your emotions as you're doing it, you might actually ruin delivery, which kind of goes against you in this case, right? So all the decisions you made just were counteracted by you being an a-hole because you can't control yourself. And I'm obviously exaggerating and embellishing, if you will.
I mean, on a certain level, if I don't know, having lived it, you're not like, it's an ism, right? That the easiest client to get is the one you already have. And the idea of like, can I grow my account 10%? And if I have 5 accounts, can I grow them each 10%? Well, that's a really solid brand new client. What's the effort to grow accounts I have 10% versus finding one brand
This
new?
is actually a really important thing. Sorry, keep going.
And if you aren't doing good work, whether that's because you didn't allocate enough budget for it because your margins were off, which we haven't even talked about how setting your margins in the operational side determines the quality of human that you get to deliver. So like if you're underpricing, and this isn't about like charge everything you can, I'm not even saying that, but I am saying if you forget operationally to understand where your margins are going, you don't know what kind of human you can get when you're in the new business conversation. So like, what do you have available to support this work? What level of quality do you get? Do you need to get a junior person that you have to train? Do you have the opportunity to get a senior person? Do you understand what that costs in your market? Like, those go into your...
And what is the impact of having a junior person versus a senior person that you're putting in front of a client and all this kind of stuff?
Right. And if you're, first of all, you can be cognizant of those discussions, of those decisions up front, even in the new business conversation, but it also impacts whether you're delivering well enough for the clients that have agreed to trust you with this work to either keep or potentially grow. Because if you can be faithful in a little, a good steward, you get typically the opportunity to be faithful in much. And if you're not, because you had to hire all junior people on a promise of yourself as a senior person, but now you have to hire, your margins weren't enough to cover another senior person to backfill you, then you aren't faithful in a little. And typically that leads to, you can't get that 10% growth from the clients that you have. And so again, your operations have actually shut down your revenue generation. And we haven't even had the conversation about a referral.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many places we can go with this. Like the flip side of this is also, well, not flip side, but this all ladders up to overarching business strategy, right? So at some point you have to decide, okay, the way that I win is by having only senior people, or the way that I win is by using offshore labor, whatever. Like, again, there's not a one size fits all, but those business decisions now ladder down to your operating model, your business model, your strategy as a whole, your marketing strategy, your sales strategy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things are now connected because of that one decision that you made. And if you say, okay, well, I'm only going to go with senior people, but you've missed the mark on your target margins, or maybe you've set them, but you didn't account for a few things. Let's just say like, oh, well, I thought it was going to be one person, but I actually now also need an account manager, which also needs to be senior. Whoops. Now my costs are almost double, and I'm now only breaking even instead of having 20% margins. Well, now you've contributed to that feast and famine cycle, and you've got the same issues that we were talking about. So these things are all interconnected, and you have to keep a close eye on them as you go. It's not a one size fits all. The other thing that we probably don't have, well, I know we don't have time to talk about today, but there is like pricing itself is a conversation. Like, so many consulting firms are still stuck on this, billable hour model. And yes, at the end of the day, in a services business, you're always selling time for dollars. Any way you slice it, even in value-based pricing, you still have to look at time spent. But when you implicitly connect the two things, it actually causes a lot of problems, especially in the market being what it is right now with AI and downward cost pressures and things like that. So there's a whole value-based pricing conversation that in theory should be had as well. But we can't really get into that.
Well,
so
I mean, maybe we should a little bit.
maybe a little bit. Here's what, let's save it for later and see if we've got time. But I think, like, for me, one of the big questions that always comes up with clients is, okay, well, we need to do these 20 things. Where do we start? What is the order of operations? And I think, Nathan, you talk a lot about dependency work, and I think that's a really important thing to get into here, because a lot of the time there's just not enough rigor that's put into that, and it catches people off guard and actually hurts margins too, by the way.
Yeah. When you think that you can do a certain amount of work and you don't recognize that, well, so consulting firms fall into this probably more than any other, like product firms rarely are going to fall into this. Partially just because it's so cost prohibitive to let yourself get dragged into those things, and it's so easy to spot. So let me just define dependency work for a second. And my favorite example is web design, because I think everyone and their mom has built a website at this point, right? It's ubiquitous in our culture, and globally, I guess. When you go to build a website, there are so many supposed help tools out there now. Like, it is so inexpensive to quote unquote build a website. You can get on Squarespace, you can get a website for $9 a month. You have all these templates and all this other stuff. And you're like, great, it is so easy and so cheap to build a website. You get in, you pay your $10, and then let's assume you already have a domain, which is the first dependency. And oops, didn't think about that. Oh, okay. So there's that first one, but let's call that simple. You get in there, you pull up your template, and then you go, now what do I say? And suddenly you're a content writer. Well, you didn't know that you had to be a content writer to build a website, right? I thought I had all these templates. That's going to do the design for me. Sure. What are you going to say? So now you're a content writer. So now you're a domain manager. You're a graphic designer. Now you're a content writer. There's all these dependencies that keep happening. And then why do you want to say it? Shit. Now I'm into, and this idea of dependency work is, this is the work that I want to do right here. And in order to get that done, there are these 4 or 5 steps leading up to it, the dependencies of this work. What I regularly see, consulting companies especially, but any service firm, is to try to take on a client who says they want this top level work done. I want you to build me a website. And they go, no problem, website building, that's what I do. And then the client realizes, oops, I need a copywriter. Oops, I don't actually have a business strategy. Oops, I don't actually have products. And you get dragged down the dependency chain until suddenly you're a firm that does everything. No, you're not. You're a firm that does graphic design who has been yanked down the dependency chain, and now you do all these other things, but you're actually still just this and a mess. So again, and that plays into revenue generation and ops, because you can't be good at everything. So now your ops are suffering. But it also begs the question of, when you go to sell, what do you sell? Anyway, that's my rant on dependency work.
Well, I think it's interesting. So there's two sides of that. There's the dependency work internally.
Yeah.
And then there's the dependency work externally. Externally side of things, this is actually, it's interesting, because this is where, if you play it right, it's actually a growth lever, in the sense of, if you deeply understand the dependency work involved in what you deliver. Let's assume you are call it a change management firm. Okay. Change management consulting firm. There's a whole bunch of dependency work that goes into technical side of things. What are the systems? Whatever, all this kind of stuff, right? So oftentimes it's very much interconnected with things like digital transformation, et cetera, right? So if you understand the different dependency pieces, now you actually, this gets into, what I often talk about as ecosystem building, which is, okay, who are the people I need to know that I can refer, that I need to interact with, that can recommend me, who I can recommend, all this kind of stuff. Instead of getting dragged in and going, well, yeah, we can do that.
Yes. I trust
you're
you more.
Go, well, yeah, we can do that. I'm going to bring in, of my team of external experts, I'm going to bring in this person because I know that they are awesome.
Yes.
Right. That's different. But if all of a sudden you are well, yeah, we can figure that out. And there's a happy medium there, right? In terms of, this kind of organic stretching over time is a good way to stress test and test into new services and things like that. So it's not that don't ever do any dependency work. But oftentimes, kind of what you see, and I'll give, the extreme example is it's usually, and this is why the largest client is oftentimes the least profitable. They're the ones that need a lot more stuff. They drag you into all these other things because they like you. They genuinely appreciate what you've delivered and as your core offering. Like, well, could you also do this? Yeah, we could do that. Could you also do this? Sure, we could do that. Next thing you know, you were ineffectively delivering in a whole bunch of stuff. And now that piece of business, while it's, say, 25% of your revenue, the margin on it is only 10% instead of your target of 20.
Well,
That's
and
a
then
problem.
internally, you try to have this conversation about like, well, who is our ideal client profile, right? ICP is like a none. And then you go to your largest client and you say, well, this is our ideal client profile. You just describe your best friend. And they're actually your worst client profile. You don't want any of those things to be true in the next client you get. But because there's such a substantial piece of your total revenue, it's like, well, this is the person we work for the best. Actually, it's the person you work for the worst. Operationally, this is awful, but they're bringing in a lot of dollars, but you haven't connected your operations in dollars. And so like when you go to do new revenue generation, the thing that's creating the most revenue is the worst thing to copy. So anyway,
And this actually gets us back to the original, one of the original points, which is a lot like bigger firms. I've seen this over and over again. So like 10 million plus. It's not necessarily bigger, but bigger relatively. They usually, like if they have this problem, they know they do, they are scared to solve it.
Mm-hmm.
They are scared to let their biggest client go, or if not let the entire client go, let part of the business that they have with them go because they're not effective at it, which means they need to replace it, which is a lot of work, and they oftentimes don't have the engine built to replace it fast enough, which again contributes to the feast-or-famine cycle. So, let's maybe the best way to do this is let's create a scenario and let's talk through what's the right, at a high level, order of operations. So let's say you're a $5 million firm, you are at whatever, say 10% margins, and so not awful, but not great. And you definitely are having this kind of feast and famine cycle over the last 3 years. And this is a really common story I hear. What do you focus on? Like how do you decide where to start?
This is tough for me because I can tell you what I've done. So I know it's a scenario, but I will speak from what I have done. The first question I ask is, what are our margin targets? And then the next question, which sometimes that takes some work. Then I say, what are our products? I'm literally doing this to 2 clients right now. I mean, we're in this conversation. I'm a year through it with one client, and I am 2 weeks through it with another client. And so what are your target margins? Okay, now that we know that, I don't care what is true. I want to know what needs to be true. So I walk in, what are our target margins? Next, what are our, I'll say offerings, because now we're in this world of like product-led, project-led operating model. I live in that. And so the word product is a little strange. What are our offerings? Cool. If I know the target margins and I know offerings, now I can start looking internally. I can just backtrack. We're a $5 million firm. We have 10% margins. Cool. Hard decision. Can you get a new client at these margins or better before I need to let someone on the team go? Because here's the harsh reality. I'm either going to let the owner and revenue generator go, meaning not make any money soon, because we have no margins to pay them, or I have to let one of the members of the team go. So the question becomes, can you generate a new client before I have to let someone from the team go to balance out the target margins? And that's the first thing I do. And that decision might take 2 weeks, 3 weeks. It might take an hour in an afternoon. That's the first thing I do and have done and am doing.
It's interesting because I'm going after the same type of decision, but I'm approaching it from the other side, which is I care, okay, how are you currently generating profits? Where is it working? Where is it not? And now let's have a conversation about why. And this gets us into a conversation about the target ICP. Who is your best fit client? And then again, I'm coming at the same thing. Either can you get another client like this, or can you increase billings with an existing client at the profit or existing clients with the profit margins that you need? And again, the purpose is the same. What's the fastest way to get you to 20% instead of 10%? And it's usually a combination, right? It's usually, okay, well, this client is, and again, there's also an important piece to remember here, and I've made this mistake before personally, which is there are your financial, like actual P&L margins, and there are your whatever, I'll call them utilization margins. And people mix those up sometimes. So for example, you may be like, well, yeah, we're really profitable on all of our stuff. Well, sure, but if we're like, if we give this person more work, then we're not really improving our margins. But the reality is, well, you are on the financial side. If the same person, sure, they need to spend more time, but if they can deliver more work and they have that capacity, awesome. Right? So you might can you get each of your clients to pay you 10% more by maybe delivering a little bit more? And then can you get another client at 20% margin? Do those two things at the same time, boom.
Yes.
Now, again, that's obviously easier said than done. The other thing I look at, and this is why I start from the front end, back end, whichever one we'd want to decide is the front or the back. But what are you currently doing to drive profits? Because that's how I answer, do you even have a solid pipeline? Do you have anybody in pipeline right now that you believe fits this mold? If you don't, that's a problem. It's a problem we need to fix. You do need to invest in that, because if you don't, you might improve your margins now, but if you don't do anything about this problem, you're going to be in the same exact situation 6 months from now.
Yeah, there are a finite number of solutions here.
Yeah.
And that's why I come back to the question that I mentioned, and that is, can you get a client at the appropriate margins before we have to let someone go? If you're small enough, the person you have to let go is the owner. If you are big enough, potentially you can let go of one team member. Maybe if you're using a contractor, you can have their time or something like that. There might be ways to mitigate this, but at the end of the day, it's, can you create a new revenue generating conversation before you have to start laying someone off? And the person who will go is going to be you, the owner, at some point.
Yep. So the other thing, and again, this is where you generally, in this type of situation for sure, you need to address both operational inefficiencies as well as growth, right? The question becomes, well, how do I fund both of these activities? Sometimes you need external help on both. Sometimes on just one. Sometimes on neither. But you still need to spend time and resources on. It might be tools. It might be media budget. It might whatever, right? So you've got an interesting way that you look at funding growth. So maybe let's talk about that briefly.
When you understand, this is one of my favorite topics, which is why I wrote down earlier, do I know what I need to sell? And then value and risk adjusted pricing. if you sell something for $1 million, and that might be far-fetched, so I'll use 100,000. If you sell something for 100,000 and you know your margin targets, I won't give this up, by the way. If you sell something for 100,000 and know your margin targets, you know you have, let's say 50, 30, 20. Again, I'm going to anchor to this very common scenario, right? You know you have $50,000 over the life of what you sold to deliver the work. So you got the work, now you need to do the work. The budget total that you have to do the work is $50,000. If you have a 50, 30, 20, it also means over the lifetime of the scope, you have $30,000 that you've already said is dedicated to operational expenses. If the entire scope is going to take, let's say, 3 months, that means you potentially could spend $10,000 a month or whatever on any operational expenses, whether that's marketing or your office or subscriptions or whatever. Let's say you only have $1,000 a month in total operational overhead. So you've just got $9,000 a month in slush over the course of the scope. Take your $30K budget, remove the 3, set it aside. That has to go into the operational expenses I know I have. Now you know I have 27 total on this contract for growth or profit, like, right? Because that's always the choice. But start with the choice. If you have 50, 30, 20, you get 50 to spend on delivery. You now mentally know I get 30 to spend on operational expenses, maybe 27 of which can go to now my marketing expense or my sales expense or whatever. And then you also know I have 20% for profit. And that's, let's call it EBITDA, right? That's where my taxes come from. There's ways to mitigate that. Like, then I get to play the game on the 20%. But I know I got paid. I know the person doing delivery got paid. And I know that I have a set aside chunk of cash. Every time you have a scope of work sold, if you have those targets, you know exactly what you get to invest over the entirety of that scope for growth. And we've just done this, again, in several of my clients and myself at How to Be Second. We've had people ask us, like, why are you pricing things that way? Because we run on 50, 30, 20. I'm not like, I'll just say that out loud. The community knows that we price things in that way. And I have said, it is so the people who are jumping into the community to support the growth of How to Be Second can get paid. I know that I have that to cover my Typeform expense, to cover my domain renewal, to cover my, right? Like, the community is supporting itself in the growth of itself. But thinking about that from a budget standpoint, right up front, lets you put money where they need to go into the appropriate buckets.
So there's an interesting conversation to be had about the growth component of this, and that's the time lag that exists on that investment. And yes, we need to consider both short-term and long-term investments and impacts, right? It's not just, hey, we're only going to focus on brand and nothing else, and this is going to pay back over 12 to 24 months or whatever it may be. But there is it's just a simple reality, not least of which is your sales cycle. But then it's, most people aren't in market at a given time. It takes, and even if they are kind of this whole idea of in market versus out of market, if we define it very clearly, it's okay. They're only in market once they have decided to solve their problem. But then there's a bunch of stuff there where, they know they have the problem. The problem is just not maybe big enough for them to solve, and it's kind of nagging, but it's not top priority. So you still got to stay in front of those people so they can remember you when the problem becomes big. So that's why this time lag exists. How do you account for that when you are doing this, right? So if you've got this, whatever, in this example, we have $27,000 to invest for growth. That $27,000 isn't going to pay back. oftentimes even within the time of that engagement, say it's a 6-month engagement, usually the impact of that investment isn't really hitting until maybe the very end of that.
And humorously, this is, I would say this is a segue actually into you answering this question, because part of the reason I think that way is to go, okay, well, I've captured operationally what I need to do to make sure that Mike has the rocket fuel that he needs. But then who steers that? Mike has to steer that. And so like, this is where we marry up the ops and the rev ops. And that is like, well, I don't know, Mike, what do you do?
Fair enough. Fair enough. So I mean, the way I think about it is, you have to have a very solid handle on your cash flow from this. This is where that part comes in. And it's, can I effectively spend these dollars, right? Because it's, yeah, sure, you've got your margin target, but is the cash actually coming in? When is it coming in? When do you need to invest, etc.? And you have to be planning for, what confidence do I have that it's going to pay back in X number of months, et cetera, et cetera. Now, early on, it's honestly more of a guess, especially if it's like very early on. If you're starting out and you have no historical data, you can use industry average and stuff to model it. You can build a synthetic forecast with, heck, even ChatGPT, et cetera. But it's kind of but then as you start getting more data, now you can start going, okay, well, on average, this kind of investment pays back in X amount of time. So you're kind of looking at, what's my current pipeline? What do I believe I can close? This investment isn't an investment in this pipeline necessarily. Some of it might be, might be like a sales enablement investment or something. And again, that's sort of how I start looking at it. If I have $27,000 to spend, and more broadly, it's, well, I've got 6 things on the books, and it's actually $150,000 to spend throughout this year based on that, because these are the things that are on the books. So then I go, okay, it looks like, and again, this is all situational, but it looks like my pipeline is short right now. If I don't close enough of these deals, I'm going to have a problem 6 months from now. So then I go, okay, well, what are the levers that I can pull within my system to improve short-term pipeline? And how much is that investment going to take? What does that leave me for long-term investment? And that's how I'm looking at it. I think that
you're touching on something I want to ask about for just a few seconds, and that is, marketing people constantly get frustrated that the first thing that gets pulled from the budget when stuff gets tight is marketing. As a person who has made that decision, I can tell you why I do that. And it is, I have a baseline understanding of what revenue I can generate with one-to-one conversations with zero marketing. Because at the end of the day, some number of conversations from my CEO is going to generate revenue. And we can hold down a baseline of that with no other support. And so what I am looking for marketing to do, what I'm looking for my rev ops at growth to do, is to increase the quality, quantity, or velocity of conversations in my pipeline. But there's a minimum number that I can hit by being a human with a network. And I don't, know. So the reason marketing gets pulled, the first thing, is because I just lean on the conversations I know I can have. It's Old Faithful, right? And if you don't have any other rev ops set up, a minimum of what you've been capable of. So that's why it always gets pulled. Marketing can't show a clear, we increased quality, quantity, and velocity in this way. You're like, well, then I know that I can have 10 coffee meetings a week and generate revenue in 2 or 3 months. Cool. I did it. I can still do it. And now I will, I guess.
So yes, And I'll challenge that just slightly, which is, so first, yes, the important part of what you said is the having an understanding that marketing as a function is non-linear, and more specifically, it's a force multiplier on your business development activity.
Yes. Oh, I love that term, force multiplier.
It's not e-commerce. The marketing isn't going to, there are some people out there that go, oh, your marketing needs to sell. I challenge that, because when you are, at least I challenge that in, not even all B2B, to be honest. I challenge that in complex services B2B, and consulting and advisory firms, things like that, because it's a relationship-driven business. It's consultative. Like, there's no amount of podcasting, lead gen, ebooks, events like this, whatever it is, whatever live events, whatever it is that you're going to do, that's going to directly and linearly go, yep, I did this, and this is the thing that that's sold on its own without a business development person having to be involved. Like, maybe like once in a blue moon, like something just falls out of it. But even then, like, there's usually something you missed, right? So the important part here is it is a force multiplier. And I think it's important to understand, what are you force multiplying?
Well said. Well said.
The challenge I will throw out there, and this is where I see firms stumble when they, and again, what you're talking about is a framework and a concept, and any framework can be like,
yeah,
bastardized, for lack of a better word, and be like, oh no, this is exactly how it works, and that's not really the case. And first you get into trouble is, as an organization grows, that network starts hitting a ceiling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what inevitably happens is, if you cut, like, the closer you are to that ceiling, when you make the decision to cut marketing, the more likely you are to hit that ceiling and actually go down.
Yeah,
because
bounce.
Your marketing itself is what's helping you to extend and expand the network that's driving more conversations. So that's the yes and thing where I want to make sure where I want to challenge a little bit, because I think
I'm glad you throw that out there, because I 1,000% agree. I wasn't necessarily saying it was good to do that, so much as like, this is why this happens.
Exactly. But I think, and from the flip side, if you are running marketing in one of these firms, you need to understand, Nathan, what you are saying. That
Yes.
is the thought process, even if it's got gaps in it. Your job is to be able to show and point out those gaps. And that's where doing like incrementality testing and things like that, where you can say, hey, by doing X, we were able to improve velocity by 20%, or we were able to drive X incremental conversations that we usually wouldn't have had, whatever it is. It's not easy, but that's how you have to look at it.
Yeah, I personally sent out 10 emails to start conversations, but I had 15 conversations, and that means 5 of them came from somewhere else.
Or it's even like, and again, this is where you have to, I always want to be careful of, there's not a single source. So yes, you might have sent out the 10 emails.
Yeah,
the question is, how many people responded to those 10 emails? Maybe you would have usually gotten 5, but you got 7.
Yeah. That was just quantity, let alone quality and velocity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like, I don't want to dig into the I would very quickly be outclassed in a discussion of how do we track and measure these things. Man, I try to keep that as simple as possible. Are we having good conversations? Do people seem to have known us before that? Okay, great. Then marketing is working.
Yeah, I think there's, especially for smaller firms, the qualitative data is more important than the quantitative data.
Yep.
That's the other piece that I think is often missed when you're trying to decide what to invest in growth and whether your investment is returning. We're oftentimes stuck in this, called the MarTech attribution trap. And whereas the qualitative data will oftentimes quickly point you, at least directionally point you to, yep, this is working. I might not know exactly how well, but it's working. Now I know where, at least now I have a hypothesis of where to dig for the quantitative piece.
Yeah. Yep.
So
I totally buy it.
Well, that hour went by really fast.
Right. I know. I have like 19 notes of things to bring up next time we have we didn't even get to talk about value versus risk adjusted pricing, like, and how no one talks about risk adjustment in the value based pricing. Anyway, that's a whole conversation I want to unpack, but we won't do it right now.
We'll have to do a part 2 at some point. Let's end it this way. One thing, if people leave here with just one thing, what is that one thing from your perspective?
The topic of the entire conversation is you can't do one without the other. So if someone says, this is the most important thing, pull back on that.
All right. I agree. I will say we didn't touch on this a ton, but I think it's the emotional conversation. While it doesn't, it's very hard to directly measure the impact of that. It does exist. And I think it's important to, if you're a leader and you're talking to your leadership team about this, that should be part of your conversation. That should be part of the change management required to make these decisions and move forward.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually something I've started doing more recently as I'm having sales conversations with clients, is talking them through like, hey, here's what you're going to feel like when we go through this. And I heard this from somebody and I took it to heart, and it's great because a lot of people don't think about that. So anyway, that's where I will leave that.
Fantastic.
All right.
How do we wrap this thing?
Just like this. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining. You can connect with Nathan and I on LinkedIn. We're more than happy to answer questions. And I'm out of town coming up here for a while, so I won't be hosting another one for about a month at this point. But I will be hosting many more of these, so tune in when you can.
I'll be back. I'll be not talking. I'll just be watching. The more I get to know you and the more that we have conversations around this stuff, the more I'm like, I want to hear what's in Mike's brain.
Good. Hopefully it's not just you. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. If you got questions, shoot them over. Happy to answer. And we'll see you all.